I'd encourage you to open up your Bible. We do have our computer back up, and so that means anything I read in reference to the text is going to be out of the Bible, and we're in Mark chapter 2 and 3 tonight. And then anything that we read outside of the main text is going to show up on the screen behind me because we have our computer fixed. Really exciting stuff. But as I went into this study this week, I actually found myself a little bit convicted and just understanding that maybe I need more rest. Does anybody feel like they need a day off? Right? I could tell you, my kid, my one son who's in high school, like every time we're in the middle of winter and it starts to snow, like he's just hoping for a snow day, right? He just wants that snow day because he wants to rest. He wants to take the day off. And so we all need it. We all need these times, these moments of rest where we can just stop and not just physical recovery, but spiritual recovery. And I started to think, well, like, how do I do that in my week? And one thing we do, we don't have a lot of rest in our week. I was convicted by that point. I should put more rest into my schedule. But one thing we do every week is we have what we call in our house Bo's Diner. And Bo is my dog, by the way, and he's not the cook. He's not the chef. But we wake up on Saturday morning, and we do Bo's Diner where we just cook this great breakfast. It's like a feast, and we all just sit together as a family, and we talk, and we argue, and we do all the things that families do when they get together around the table. Like I already know Isaiah's favorite food is biscuits and gravy. That's what he wants at Bo's Diner. Michael's, pancake sandwiches. And January's just less picky. But we sit together, and it takes, about 2 hours where we just sit together as a family. We talk about our jobs, things going on at the church, what life is like. And it's just a chance to reconnect with our family. And we definitely need more of those times, right? Because we live in this world where it can just become so exhausting all the time to be just existing in the dominion of darkness. You wake up, you go to work, and your coworkers are kind of hard to deal with, and it's exhausting. And you come home and you just want to rest, right? Or maybe it's not your coworkers that's the problem. Maybe it's just you turn on the TV. Who's exhausted by all the nonsense that is on the TV, and you turn it on, and it would be just so nice, that the TV has an off button, just so you guys know, right? It'd be so nice if you can just turn it off and just shut the rest of the world off for a moment and just rest. You don't really get a chance because from the second you wake up, your alarm clock on your phone, is going off, and you reach over to grab the phone and turn off the alarm clock, and then Apple News, pops up with the latest news. You do get no rest. It's just already telling you all the things that you have to be anxious about and worried about and think about. Before you even have a chance to take your first morning thoughts, you're being told of all the things that you should worry about. And what you really need is to put down that phone and rest, right? Just get away from all of it. Not just physical rest, but spiritual rest, right? We need those moments that we can just reconnect with God. And I like January's meditation, like we can be in the winter, right? And take that time to rest. One nation that did this well was the nation of Israel. They had built into their law, in fact, God builds it into creation, a day of rest. You guys know it as the Sabbath, right? And it took God 6 days to create the heavens and the earth. And on the seventh day, he rested. And I just wonder, why did he rest? Do you think God got tired? But after 6 days, he's like, oh, that's enough work. I need to take a nap. No, I don't think that was in God's mind. But maybe he did it to model something for us who was created in the image and the likeness of God. He did it to model something about us and our needs, because it could become so easy to work 7 days a week and to be on all the time without ever turning off, disconnecting, and resting. And so God builds into the very nature of creation a day of rest because we need it, right? And I think for the people of Israel, this day became so valuable, something they would hold on to, because just imagine, God chose a slave nation to become a kingdom of priests. And I think of the people of Israel living in Egypt, and they're oppressed by the Egyptians and pharaohs, and they're making the mud bricks for their towns, and they're working every day. They wake up and they go to work, and they come home, and then they wake up and they go to work, and it's just nonstop work. And I picture these slaves in Egypt sitting there at night when they're finally able to take a moment off, and they're sitting there, and maybe they're telling their children about the days of creation, and they get to that seventh day, and they say, God rested on the seventh day. And as slaves sitting in Egypt, I wonder if they went, oh, I look forward to the day that I get to rest, that the slavery that I'm in bondage to is no longer there. And so when God gave them the law, he put in that law, not just in creation itself, but in the law, a Sabbath, because we all need time to rest. And I'm just going to show you, because Israel's idea of the Sabbath changes over time. Like they begin to reassess, why are they taking this Sabbath? And so we're going to look at two scriptures where God commands the Sabbath. It's in the Ten Commandments, and one is in Exodus, one is Deuteronomy. But you're going to notice that the reason behind the Sabbath changes between Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus chapter 20, it says this: remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor your foreigners residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Like, think about in Exodus, he's saying you need this moment of rest because God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh, he rested. And so when the people of Israel were there but next to Mount Sinai getting the law, the Sabbath was connected to creation. Something about us and the way that we were created means that we should probably take a moment of rest. I think the slaves who had come out of Egypt thanked God for it. They finally can stop making mud bricks. They finally can take part in this beautiful gift that God gave them, a gift of rest, a Sabbath. By the time we get to Deuteronomy, this is much later in history, right? Most of the people who came out of Egypt have probably passed away, and Moses is getting ready to tell them about what it's going to be like when they go to the other side of the river. And so most of the people he's talking to have probably grown up in the wilderness. And so God has to re-give them the law and through Moses. And he tells them about the Sabbath, and this is what it says. Observe the Sabbath day. This is Deuteronomy chapter 5, by the way, verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your sons, or your daughters, nor your male or female slaves, nor your ox, your donkey, or any other animals, nor any foreigners residing in your town, so that your male and female servants may rest as you did. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. You notice how it changes? Why do they do the Sabbath? Well, in Exodus, the Sabbath day is connected to creation. You rest because God rested, and you are created in the image of God. Therefore, you need to sleep too. Right? You need to rest. I'm not going to say that God sleeps. That was probably a misstep, right? But you need to rest. But then, 40 years later, when Moses gives this same law, it changes just a little bit. You rest because you need to remember the deliverance, that God loved you so much that he pulled you out of slavery and brought you into this promised land. And because God delivered you, rest. And in both cases, what do you think the point of that was? To sit down and to shut the rest of the world off and focus on what God has done through his creation, through his deliverance. So hard to do, right? Especially in our world where we're just constantly like, we don't know what it's like to be bored, right? Ask my son. He has no idea. He's like, I need to play a game. There's nothing to do, Dad. Rest. Just rest. And why do you rest? Because when you rest, you remember God and his creation. You remember God and his deliverance. We need rest. And so we come to this New Testament time, and Christians don't keep the Sabbath in the same way that they did in Israel, right? We have the Lord's Day. Why? Because Jesus rose on the first day of the week. The day of Pentecost, when the Spirit was poured out, was on the first day of the week, right? John is in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. In Acts chapter 20, we find that the early church was meeting, and what day do you think they were meeting on? The Lord's Day. Acts chapter 20, verse 7, it says this: on the first day of the week we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because they intended to leave the next day, kept talking until midnight. I'm not going to be doing that tonight, by the way, not speaking till midnight. But do you notice that the early church is coming together on the first day of the week, right? Why are they doing it? To break bread, to have communion with one another, to take a moment out of the busyness of the rest of the week and to think about Christ and what he's accomplished. Not the deliverance from slavery in Egypt, but deliverance from slavery to sin, right? That we've been redeemed, that we've been justified, and we look forward to the hope that we have in Christ that we'll get to share in his glory, right? And so we, each week, we do it here. We take a moment to rest, not just physically, but spiritually, to come to his table to rest and to remember the deliverance. And the reason I'm dwelling on this Sabbath is because, well, the Sabbath is going to be the topic of the stories we're going through in Mark. See, by the time we get to the first century, the Jews have taken the Sabbath, something that was supposed to be beautiful and something that was supposed to help people and show them the deliverance that's possible with God and show them how much he loved him through his creation. They began to put so many traditions and rules on this Sabbath that it began not to be a day of rest, but a day of burden, a day of like struggle, trying to like stress, trying to figure out how to live your life so that you don't break any rules. And they began to, that perspective of the Sabbath had changed because they were so absolute on their laws that they forgot to find rest on the day of rest. And so Jesus is going to confront that in the stories we're talking about today. Jesus is going to confront that. He's going to show us some really important things about who he is, about what God wants, how to rest today. There's going to be all these stories, but we're in Mark chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 23. Now, here's how the story goes. It says, on the Sabbath, that day of rest that I just talked about, right? On the Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along, and they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? I was thinking about this, like, we know it's the Sabbath. You're not supposed to be doing any work. And here's the disciples, and they're walking through a grain field. And for some reason, Mark doesn't even tell us why, the religious leaders are there watching them. Like, not just religious leaders, but maybe the religious police, making sure. Like, these types of people? They pretend that they're perfect, but then they look over your shoulder to make sure that you're doing everything right. And guess what? You're not. You're not going to do everything right. You're going to make mistakes. But these are the kind of people also that you can look at them, and if you examine them a little bit closer, you'll see that they're hypocritical, right? But they're the religious police, and they're watching Jesus for some reason as he walks through the grain field with his disciples, and they see his disciples taking the grain, and they say, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And maybe in our modern ideas, we might think, well, what they're doing that's unlawful is trespassing. They're walking on somebody else's grain field. Maybe that's what they're doing that's wrong, but that's not the case, right? They're taking grain. Maybe that's what they're doing that's wrong. That I think in our society, if I went to somebody's field and started picking their produce, I might get in a little bit of trouble for that, right? Maybe. Hopefully the farmer's nice, right? But in the law, there's provisions for all of those things. The disciples are doing nothing wrong by walking through somebody's grain field, by picking grain. They're doing nothing wrong in that side of it. What they're doing is they're doing something that the Pharisees see as breaking the Sabbath. They're taking the grain, and they might be rubbing it in their fingers or in their hands to get the chaff away, and then they're eating the seeds. Like, it's just a little tiny bit, but do you notice the harvest? You pick, you take the chaff away, and then you eat. They're harvesting. And the Pharisees, the religious police, they're looking at this and they're saying, your disciples are doing something that is unlawful on the Sabbath. Now, most of the time when we tell this story, we think, well, look at those Pharisees. They're just nitpicking. Did God really care that much about the Sabbath that he won't let them do this type of thing? Do you know in the book of Numbers, God is so angry that somebody goes out and gathers firewood on the Sabbath that he puts them to death? So before we get too upset with the Pharisees, the law is pretty clear. You're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath, right? But maybe the Pharisees have missed the point just a little, right? So Jesus tells them this. I think it's important, before I tell you what Jesus tells them, Jesus doesn't say they're wrong. Jesus doesn't say, hey, you don't understand the law. Let me fix this for you. Like, he doesn't. What he says to them is he says, have you never read what David did when him and his companions were hungry and in need? In the day of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Have you ever heard about that? You guys ever read that? It's in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And David leaves and he goes into the temple to get showbread, right? This is only for the priest, but he's in a desperate situation and he needs to make sure that he has food. And so he takes what's only lawful for the priest and he gives it to his companions, his disciples, maybe you want to call them. Now, it's kind of like, it would be obvious if you're a Pharisee in the first century, you know this story, right? I mean, the Jews knew the Hebrew scriptures well. So when Jesus asks them, have you ever heard? Maybe it's a little insulting, right? Of course they've heard. Be like me telling Ken, hey, did you ever read Deuteronomy? Of course. Why, of course he's read Deuteronomy. I mean, he's been a pastor for a long time. Of course he's read Deuteronomy. The real question might be, do you understand what was happening? Or maybe this, was David right in what he did? And that's an interesting question. I read this week different ideas on whether or not David was right, not just from Christian perspectives, but from Jewish perspectives. What David do when he went in there and he took the bread, was that right? And just about everybody is in agreement that when the king does something through mercy and gives it to his disciples, that was okay. The king was acting in mercy. And so what Jesus does here is so cool. He overlaps what he's doing with his disciples with what David did. It sets a precedent, and the precedent is this. When the king, because of mercy, makes an exception, then that might be okay. Right? That's the reason Jesus brings up this story, because if the Pharisees, and most likely they did, they accepted that what David did was right because he was king. So here's Jesus, the Messiah, walking with his disciples, and he allows them to eat the grain. The precedent is when the king, through mercy, allows his disciples to eat. It's what Jesus says later, because in his response to them, I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. He has two responses. I'm going to jump to the second one. The second response is in verse 27 or verse 28. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Do you see what he's saying is that I have the authority as king to dictate this day. The Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. And so if David, what he did was okay, how much more is what Jesus doing okay? How much? It's so much more, right? Because he is the Son of Man. This is the second time Jesus has used this Son of Man wording. And both times he's pointing to his authority, right? The first time he said, so that you know the Son of Man has power to forgive sins, I tell you, take the mat and walk. This time, what he's saying is the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. When Jesus uses this title, Son of Man, he's talking about the authority that he has, and that authority is linked to Daniel chapter 7, We're going to read it again real quick. In Daniel chapter 7, it says this. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, right? Like a son of man. Coming in the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people in every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Notice from the very opening of Mark, Jesus is pronounced king. He preaches a kingdom that is coming, and repent and believe the message. He shows how to respond to that kingdom message, and he talks about the authority he has as king to forgive sins and as Lord of the Sabbath. Like Jesus, obviously, it has to be more than just a child of Adam, because, well, not any son of man is Lord of Sabbath. Only the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so the first way that Jesus approaches this is by saying, I have the authority to allow my disciples to do that. But look what he also says before he even talks about being Son of Man. He says something about what the Sabbath was created for. He says in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's about, like, if you think through that statement for just a second, is the Sabbath something that was supposed to be good for us? Or was it something that was supposed to oppress? See, if it's meant to oppress, then that means man was meant to serve the Sabbath. But if Sabbath was created for man, then Sabbath was something that was meant to benefit us. Now, because of the Pharisees' nitpicking and perspective on this, they've lost the point. They've lost the meaning of the Sabbath. And so no longer for them is it a day of rest, but it's a day of restriction and hard like trying to figure out how to live your life, what is right and what is wrong, and it becomes constraining to them. But Jesus is saying, you know what? The Sabbath was actually meant for man. Why? To give them rest, to give them peace, to give them a chance to reflect on the deliverance that God has taken them. As he's delivered them through the desert. The Sabbath was meant for man, but the way that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law practiced it became man for the Sabbath, man for the Sabbath. It was oppressive. And I don't know if I said it, but that's my point, is that the first point was that the Sabbath is a gift and not a burden, right? The way the Pharisees treated this, the Sabbath was not a gift, it was a burden. But Jesus is saying, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and it is meant for good. It is meant for something that is a gift, not something that's supposed to become oppressive. My second point is going into the second story. We're moving on to chapter 3, so we're starting to make our way through Mark. But this next story is also linked to the Sabbath. And so in chapter 3, we find this. It says, another time when Jesus went to the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there, some of them were looking for reasons to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal them on the Sabbath. Do you see the religious police again? They're watching, just waiting for him to make some kind of mistake. Verse 3, Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So here we are. My second point is that the Sabbath was meant for good and not for evil. That the Sabbath was meant for good and not for evil. Here we are back in the synagogue, and in the synagogue they're also on the Sabbath. Whether or not this is the same Sabbath or another Sabbath, we don't know, but Jesus is there, and all of them, we're just supposed to assume that them are the religious leaders, those religious police that were watching Jesus pick the grain in the grain field. Now they're in the synagogue watching to see if he's going to heal somebody on the Sabbath. And do you notice they're bent on evil? They're bent on evil. They're sitting there in the synagogue, and here's this man with the shriveled hand. Now, some things about this man with the shriveled hand. It's a kind of society that you need to work in order to live, right? How much work do you think a man with a shriveled hand can do? So he most likely lived in poverty. And he's struggling through this life, living in poverty. And the common thought in the first century was that he probably deserved to be there, right? Like think about the Jesus' own disciples. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind, right? And so that was the way that they saw people like this with the shriveled hand. Not only is he in poverty and he should be sitting over there, but he probably deserves what he got. And Jesus comes along and he sees the man and he wants to do good for the man. But the Pharisees can't see the man. All they can see is their evil thoughts. They instead of looking at the man, they look for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. I mean, they're bent on evil, and Jesus is bent on good. Jesus has the man stand up, and when he has the man stand up, I think he's speaking directly to their heart, because apparently he knows what they're thinking. And he has the man stand up in front of everyone, and he asks this softball question that anybody should be able to answer. His question is simple. He says, what is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Pretty easy question, right? I mean, the Sabbath was meant for good. Man was, the Sabbath was created for man, meant for good. Even the Pharisees accepted this was good, that it was meant for good. They would do good things on the Sabbath, right? Here's a verse from Luke chapter 13, verse 15. Jesus answered them, you hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie an ox or a donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Like they would accept that it's okay to give your ox or your donkey water on the Sabbath. So they get the principle of what Jesus is saying here. Is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? They would say, of course, it should be lawful to do good. You should be doing good on the Sabbath, right? I mean, that's what the law is supposed to be about. Micah 6:8, he has shown us what is good and what the Lord requires, to act justly and to love mercy. Just think about that second part, to love mercy. And Jesus is looking at this man with the shriveled hand, and he's got mercy. And the Pharisees are bent on evil, trying to figure out a way that they can accuse Jesus. One's bent on good, one's bent on evil. And Jesus, by making the man stand, speaks directly to their heart and says, what's right? Softball question. They should have been able to say right away, you should do good on the Sabbath. You should take your donkey to get water. You should do good on the Sabbath. But they're unable to answer because their heart is so, well, maybe it's not only the man's hand that is shriveled. Maybe their heart is so messed up that they can't see the good that they should be doing. That's what James says. Anybody who knows the good who does that they ought to do and doesn't do it, that person sins. And so Jesus leads them out, has them stand, asks the question that they should have been able to answer, but they remain silent. That's what Mark says. And Jesus is angry and distressed at their stubborn hearts, and he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. You have two sets of people. I think it's important maybe just to think, did Jesus break the Sabbath? Did he get up and move around? Did he walk a mile? From the story I'm reading, he was there. He spoke to the man walked, and then he spoke to the man, and the man was clean or healed. Jesus did no work. But if one of them did, the Pharisees who looked for a way to go after this, to accuse Jesus, or if Jesus, the one who healed, which one, if they did work, just assume they did, which one worked for good and which one worked for evil? See, the Pharisees don't even recognize that which side they're on. And when Jesus heals them, they don't celebrate the man's healing. They team up with the Herodians so that they can figure out a way to kill Jesus. But here's, I think, a principle that we should be taking with us. Like the first principle was that the Sabbath was made for man. We should be taking moments of rest. Second principle is that the Sabbath is meant for good, not for evil. We should be doing good, right? Our focus should be on mercy and justice. He's shown you what is good and what the Lord requires. Our focus should be on that. But their focus was on evil. And so, along with the Herodians, by the way, Mark is the only one that mentions the Herodians. It's just they're followers of Herod, whether it's Herod the Great or Herod Antipas, right? It's followers of Herod, and that's just a Greek way of saying followers of. You might even notice that Herodian sounds a lot like Christian, right? That bottom part is followers of, right? So they start to plot. They are doing evil on the Sabbath. My third point, and I'm going to be real quick on this, is that the touch of faith provides rest, right? See, Jesus is the Lord of Sabbath. Sabbath was meant for good. Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was meant for good. And Jesus is the one who really brings rest today, right? Jesus is the one who really brings rest today. In the rest of chapter 7 and following, what we're going to find is that Jesus withdraws again, right? In verse 7, it says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all that he was doing, people came from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. They're coming from other places. Like the message of the kingdom is spreading, and they're coming to see what Jesus is doing. Why do you think they showed up? They wanted rest. They were looking for hope. And here's these religious leaders. They're bent on evil. Is there any hope there? But Jesus is full of hope. And so they come to him in such a large crowd that Jesus has to get in a boat. Verse 9, because the crowd, he told the disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the crowd from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch them. They just wanted to touch Jesus, just so they could find rest, hope, deliverance. And, how great would it be to be able to touch Jesus? But, we don't have to touch Jesus to find rest. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. He provides rest. That's what Jesus said. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Martin Luther wrote this, and I thought it was interesting, so I put it down. It says, it is by faith that we touch Jesus. And it is far better to touch him by faith than by touch or handle him with the hands only and not by faith. It was no great thing to merely touch him manually. Even his oppressors doubtlessly touched him when they apprehended him, bound him, crucified him. But their ill-motivated touch, they lost precisely what they were laying hold of. O worldwide church, it is by touching him faithfully that your faith has made you whole. Think about all the people that got to touch Jesus and did not find rest. But when we approach him the way that he's commanded to approach, repent, reorient your life to the kingdom reality, believe this message. Belief is an active verb, like you have to live this message. That is the kind of thing that brings wholeness to our life. That's the kind of thing that brings us rest. Who wants a day off? We all need spiritual rest, right? Jesus can give it. Jesus has brought us true rest, right? Jesus has brought us what is good. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. We need rest, and I think one thing that was brought out tonight is that when we come to church and we worship Jesus and we commune at his table and we learn his word, we are doing positive things that bring rest to our soul. There are other things that we can do to bring rest to our soul. We can turn off that TV, shut down that phone, let go of some of the things that are bringing so much anxiety to your life. put them down and pick Jesus up. Because when you come to him, he will provide true rest.